Hello, Mr. Hardy here, and in this video I would like to teach you about the poem What Were They Like by Denise Levertov. So, we're going to start by reading What Were They Like by Levertov. We'll then check we understand what's going on in the poem. I'll point out the key message of the poem and the areas in which we can explore conflict. I'll identify some key linguistic, structural and poetic devices Levertov uses. And I'll leave you with a couple of tasks you can complete after the video to solidify your knowledge of this poem. So, Denise Levertov. She was a British-American poet, so I believe she was born in Britain and then moved to America. She was an English teacher, as all cool people are, though my opinion might be a bit biased. She was born in 1923 and died in 1997. And she wrote this poem, What Were They Like, in 1966. Remember that date because it will prove useful later. And this poem is a protest poem, so she wrote it to protest against something. And what she was protesting against was the Vietnam War, which happened between 1955 and 1975. Now, if you remember the date in which she wrote the poem, 1966, it is slap bang in the middle of the Vietnamese War. So by this stage, there was a lot of people who were fed up with America's involvement in the Vietnam War, and they created protest poetry. Some people even created protest songs, like the famous singer-songwriter Bob Dylan in his song With God on Our Side. And America had a real uproar, a real outcry about their involvement in the Vietnam War. So, very quickly, I'm no history teacher, but roughly what happened with the Vietnam War? Well, it was a war of ideology, political ideas, but instead of, debating it peacefully, both countries went to war with guns and bombs, and there were very real consequences, such as death and human suffering. To put it simply, at the time, Vietnam was split into two, North Vietnam and South Vietnam. And North Vietnam, with the support of China, wanted to practice and promote the political ideology of communism, and they wanted to spread that into South Vietnam. Now, South Vietnam wanted to uphold political ideas of capitalism, and America, which is a capitalist country, wanted to support South Vietnam with this to resist the spread of communism from the North. So America got involved with the Vietnam War, even though Vietnam is thousands and thousands of miles away from America. And the way America got involved was through use of military force. So I've got a few examples here. I remember my history teacher telling me. One was Operation Rolling Thunder. So this is where America sent big planes to fly across Vietnam and drop bombs. And obviously when bombs explode, they're loud, they sound like thunder. And by calling it rolling thunder, it implied that the bombs never stopped, like an ongoing storm, an ongoing assault over Vietnam. Another type of military mission Americans went on were search and destroy missions. So this is where America deployed troops on the ground, and they would sniff out information about communist sympathizers, people who wanted to support the spread of communism. And if they found information out, they would go and search out these people and destroy their villages, literally burn them down, kill the villagers. It was very violent. America also dropped a lot of napalm bombs and napalm strikes over Vietnam. Napalm is a horrible chemical. It's basically a mixture of like petrol or diesel, the stuff you put in your car to power your car. But it's mixed with like a jelly-like substance, like Vaseline or like a petroleum jelly. And the result is it sort of sticks to you and it burns on you. So if napalm lands on your skin, it will burn on your skin for a number of minutes. So very painful. If it doesn't kill you, it's going to leave you with severe damage to your skin. Vietnam, if you've ever been there or seen it on a map, it's a long, thin country in Southeast Asia, and it's almost entirely forest and jungle. It's very green. And what happened was America, using their aeroplanes, that they couldn't actually see their enemies. Now, the North Vietnamese, used a military tactic called guerrilla warfare. This meant that they were digging in tunnels and travelling underground and sort of living in trees, and they were trying to fight in a way that blended in with the forest jungle environment. And America was really struggling to have an effect. So they used Agent Orange, which is basically a herbicide. That means it kills plants, it kills green living things. And they used crop dusters, which is an aeroplane that farmers use to spread, fertilizer over their fields. They used crop dusters to spread Agent Orange, this herbicide, all over Vietnam to try and deforest it, to get rid of the trees so that when they flew their American planes over, they could do surveillance, they could do reconnaissance and take photos of Vietnam and plan their next military move. However, in Agent Orange, there is a chemical called thalidomide, and this thalidomide was entering into the Vietnamese women, and when they were giving birth, the thalidomide was passing into future Vietnamese babies, and it was causing all sorts of limb deformities, and maybe babies being born stillborn, so that they were born but they weren't alive. And there were some really horrible consequences on future generations of Vietnamese children because of Agent Orange. If you really want to, you can go to Google Images and search, thalidomide babies or Vietnamese thalidomide babies, and you can see some images, but just be warned that they can be shocking and upsetting. And finally, the My Lai massacre. This was a search and destroy mission of a village called My Lai. And the significance here is this was the first time in warfare that sort of film cameras were used. They were making cameras that were small enough to attach to soldiers' helmets or for soldiers to carry into the battlefield with them. So this was the first time that war footage was being sent home to the American public. Now, prior to the Vietnam War, if you asked an American citizen what they thought about American soldiers, they would have said they were great. They were upholding ideals such as freedom. They were promoting democracy. But after the Vietnam War, after they saw footage of American soldiers killing old men, old women, even raping young girls, they had a change of mind. They realized that actually maybe American influence in Vietnam and other countries wasn't having the positive effect that they thought. And this really opened up the eyes of the American public. And this is what inspired the protest poems and the protest songs of that generation. Okay, history lesson over. Back to English literature. Let's read What Were They Like by Denise Levertov. Did the people of Vietnam use lanterns of stone? Did they hold ceremonies to reverence the opening of buds? Were they inclined to quiet laughter? Did they use bone and ivory, jade and silver for ornament? Had they an epic poem? Did they distinguish between speech and singing? Sir, their light hearts turned to stone. It is not remembered whether in gardens stone lanterns illumined pleasant ways. Perhaps they gathered once to delight in blossom, but after their children were killed, there were no more buds. Sir, laughter is bitter to the burned mouth. A dream ago perhaps, ornament is for joy. All the bones were charred. It is not remembered. Remember, most were peasants. Their life was in rice and bamboo. When peaceful clouds were reflected in the paddies, and the water buffalo stepped surely along terraces, maybe fathers told their sons old tales. When bombs smashed those mirrors, there was only time to scream. Yet, there is an echo yet of their speech, which was like a song. It was reported their singing resembled the flight of moths in moonlight. Who can say? It is silent now. So that is the poem, 2 stanzas. But what is going on? To understand this poem, you need to know that there is a question-answer structure that Levertov has deployed. There are 2 speakers, you can call them personas in the poem. In stanza 1, speaker 1 asks 6 questions about the country of Vietnam and the Vietnamese people. Now, I've heard people analyse this poem and say that speaker one is maybe an American news reporter or an American journalist interviewing someone and asking about Vietnam. And personally, I'd be inclined to believe this. In stanza 2, speaker 2 provides 6 answers to the questions. Now, I've also heard through analysis of this poem, some people argue that speaker 2 is maybe an American soldier who's returned from deployment in Vietnam and is providing information about what they remember about the Vietnamese people. I've also heard that it might be a Vietnamese person who has sort of survived the Vietnam War and has moved to America and is now doing an interview to educate Americans about their culture and their old homeland. I've also heard ideas such as speaker 2 being a historian who's studied about Vietnam and Vietnamese people and is now trying to provide answers to the interviewer or journalist. Personally, I haven't made up my mind which I believe is true. I think you can find evidence for all 3 ideas in the poem at different moments. Structurally, what you need to know is this poem is written in free verse. Free verse means there isn't really any restraints. There's no syllabic restraints. There's no rhyme restraints. The poet is free to use as long or as short lines and stanzas as they want. And I believe Levertov does this to make her poems sound a bit like a conversation between 2 people, a bit like an interview between a journalist and someone giving answers about Vietnam. What you need to know is there's only 2 stanzas, but between stanza 1, which is full of 6 questions, and stanza 2, which is the 6 answers to the question, there is a volta, there is a change of tone. We're going from questioning to answering. So what I've done quite helpfully here, and what I encourage my students in class to do, is to identify the 6 questions from stanza 1. You can separate them using colours like I've done on this slide, or you can separate them using numbers if you prefer. And then go through stanza 2 and using the same colour system or the same number system, identify the answers and the questions that match. So for example, did the people of Vietnam use lanterns of stone? That is the first question. That matches with Sir, their light hearts turned to stone. It is not remembered whether in gardens stone lanterns illumined pleasant ways. That is the first answer. So what I encourage you to do, maybe pause the video and on your physical copy of the poem, make sure you have matched up the 6 questions with the 6 answers. Okay, if you're back and listening to me, it means you have matched up the 6 questions and 6 answers. I'm going to go through it question and answer at a time and give a quick explanation as to what is going on before doing a more detailed analysis later. So question 1 and answer 1 surrounds Vietnamese life. The reporter wants to know, did the people of Vietnam use lanterns of stone? And the second speaker who's answering them said it's not really remembered. We can't remember. Vietnamese culture has been destroyed and gone. Question 2 and answer 2 is about Vietnamese religion. Did they have ceremonies to reverence the opening of buds? And the answer is they no longer have these ceremonies. Question 3 and answer 3 is about the Vietnamese people themselves. Did they like to laugh? And the answer is that they were definitely not laughing whilst America was involved in the war. Question 4, answer 4 is about Vietnamese craftsmanship. Craftsmanship is your ability to make things. And the answer is that they used to make beautiful ornaments, but nowadays they do not. Question 5 and answer 5 is about Vietnamese art. Did they write an epic poem? Did they have a specific type of poetry? And the answer is no, they had their own type of poetry, but that was destroyed because of the war. And question 6 and answer 6 is about Vietnamese sort of culture and habits. Could you distinguish between Vietnamese people speaking and Vietnamese people singing? And the answer was that they spoke and they sang beautifully, but they no longer speak and they no longer sing anymore. Okay, I will break down each question and answer in detail in a bit, but first, following through our plan, let's explore the poem's message. What Would I Like by Levertov is a protest poem against America's involvement during the Vietnam War. The American public, through the use of video footage, were learning more and more about what was going on in Vietnam, and they really objected to it. And as I mentioned, there were loads of poems and songs where American public were demonstrating to their government that they were not okay with America's influence in Vietnam. The poem is also a criticism of conflict, particularly conflict in the form of war, because war causes the suffering of humans and it causes the loss of culture. And I think preserving culture and limiting suffering are two good things, and war directly contradicts that. It causes suffering and it destroys culture. And Levertov is criticizing war, criticizing conflict. So, where can we explore conflict in What Would I Like? War conflicts with culture. So Vietnam was quite a peaceful culture. They grew their own food. They made their own craftsmanship, statues and tools. They sang. They were quite a peaceful country. And then along came sort of China and America and were influencing Vietnam with war, and that destroyed all of Vietnam's culture. There's also conflict ruining people's lives. We get some really violent images of the effects of war on the Vietnamese people. We also explore the idea that conflict causes suffering, again through imagery and other techniques. Levertov explores how war and conflict causes suffering in people. We get conflict between the East and the West. So the Vietnamese War obviously concerned Vietnam, which is a country in Asia. So what were America, which is a Western country, doing getting involved in the East? This idea of keeping them separate and having conflict of interest between the West and the East. And if you remember my brief history of the Vietnamese War, it was a war of political ideals, communism versus capitalism. These two theoretical ideas were in conflict, but unfortunately, instead of talking about it and debating about it, they went to war, and there was very real physical conflict with very real physical consequences. Okay, so Levertov uses a range of techniques. Linguistically, she uses metaphors, alliteration, questions, a repetition, past tense, verbs, and adverbs. Structurally, she uses free verse, so it's an irregular structure. There's no limitations, and that is to create a natural conversation, like a interviewer interviewing someone. And that is backed up by this question-answer format. Stanza 1 is 6 questions, stanza 2 is 6 answers. Poetically speaking, there is a volta between stanza 1 and 2, a change in tone, where we shift from questions to answers. We also have caesura, tone, and imagery being deployed by Levertov. So let's look at that first question and that first answer in detail, the one that surrounds Vietnamese life. Did the people of Vietnam use lanterns of stone? First thing you want to note is the past tense did. What Levertov has done with this poem is she's painting the picture of a future where Vietnam has been completely destroyed. So imagine that Vietnam no longer exists, all the Vietnamese people are gone, the country has been bombed through Operation Rolling Thunder and deforested through Agent Orange and napalmed to death. It's just a destroyed wasteland. All of Vietnam's religion and culture and craftsmanship and people have all been destroyed. So this is the scene you've got to imagine. So by using the past tense, Levertov is suggesting that if conflict continues, if America's influence in Vietnam continues unchecked, Vietnam will be completely destroyed. It will be in the past tense. Now, speaker 1, who is arguably an American interviewer or reporter, doesn't even do the research properly. They don't know how to spell Vietnam. Vietnam is one word where N should have a lowercase n and should be joined to the Viet. So by spelling Vietnam incorrectly, it makes this American reporter come across as quite ignorant. Now remember, this is a protest poem, and Levertov is protesting against America, the country she was living in at the time. So she wants to make America look bad, and she wants to make Vietnam look good. And she does this through a variety of techniques. And one way she makes Vietnam look really good is by using natural imagery. All of the images of Vietnam are natural and peaceful, and most of the images of America's influence in this war are violent and destructive images. And of course, if you are quoting this, you can identify it as a question, an interrogative sentence. The response to the question is sir. Sir creates quite a formal tone, a bit like a student calling their male teacher sir. This is where some people think it's an American soldier who is speaker 2 answering the question, because soldiers tend to respond with sir or ma'am. I would also argue that this might prove it is a Vietnamese person talking about their own culture, because if you ever go to Vietnam or the East, in general, it's quite a polite culture, and they will refer to foreigners as sir or ma'am as well. So the sir creates a formal tone, and the caesura, which is the comma next to sir, the punctuation in the middle of a line, creates a pause. And this creates quite an uncertain tone, a bit like the second speaker is having to think of their answer because they can't remember what happened in Vietnam because it's been completely destroyed. Sir, their light hearts turned to stone. Here we have a metaphor. Hearts are normally red and soft and beating. That's a good sign that you're alive if your heart is red and soft and beating. However, if your heart has turned to stone, it's lost its redness, it's become grey, the colour of a dead body, of lifelessness. And you know, stones don't move, they don't beat. If your heart's full of stone, maybe you're sad, maybe you're dead. And it's this idea that America has come along and it's taken all these Vietnamese hearts and it's killed them. Whether that's literally through bombs and military operations, or whether that's metaphorically, it's made Vietnamese people very sad that their country is in conflict, is in war. It is not remembered. This little phrase here again emphasizes this uncertain tone. No one really knows what Vietnam is like anymore because America has completely destroyed it in this hypothetical future that Levertov has created. And I've underlined stone lanterns because the question asks for lantern of stones, and the answer has provided it, stone lanterns illumined pleasant ways. Question 2 and answer 2. The question is this. Did they hold ceremonies to reverence the opening of buds? Did again create a past tense. Vietnam has been destroyed by America. The pronoun they is really interesting because it creates a sense of them versus us. The reporter, the American news reporter or journalist, could have said, did the Vietnamese or did the Vietnamese people hold ceremonies? But by saying they, it sort of makes them sound like an other, like they or foreigners or Easterners. And it creates a them versus us attitude. We are Americans, we are Westerners, we are us, we are capitalist, and they are foreign, they are communist. And it sort of subconsciously creates a rivalry, a separation between the two races. Did they hold ceremonies to reverence the opening of buds? I think this is to do with religion. So in America, it's predominantly a Christian country, but in Vietnam, I believe it's predominantly Buddhist. And again, you have this natural imagery of buds opening, of celebrating nature and blossoms. It paints Vietnam in a very beautiful picture. And of course, if you refer to this line, it is a question. And the response that speaker 2 gives is this. Perhaps they gathered once to delight in the blossom. The adverb perhaps creates a very uncertain tone. Again, no one really remembers what Vietnam is like because it's been completely destroyed by America. But after their children were killed, there were no more buds. Levertov has used another metaphor here. And this time she's comparing Vietnamese children to buds, buds on a plant. Now, a bud is the part of the plant that is about to bloom. It's about to open up and reveal its beauty. Now, if a plant has a really good bud that blooms, you would say it's a successful plant. And from that bloom, there'll be further seeds that you can harvest and more plants will grow. However, if a gardener were to cut off the bud, that plant can no longer grow, it's dead. So children are a bit like the buds for a society. Children indicate the future of that society. If they open and bloom and do well, that will be a successful society. But if they're cut off, then that society is doomed to fail. There is no one else to continue those cultural traditions and language and religion. And here, America is the metaphorical gardener that has cut off all the Vietnamese buds. Remember I told you about those thalidomide babies from Agent Orange? America has affected the fertility of the Vietnamese people, and it's going to affect their future generations. So not only are the current Vietnamese suffering and dying, their children are also going to suffer as a result of this conflict. And again, I've underlined buds because it's in the question, and buds because it's in the answer. And that's another piece of evidence that this question and this answer links. Okay, question 3 and answer 3 is very short. Were they? Again, at the risk of sounding like a broken record, were is past tense. Vietnam's been destroyed. They creates a them and us, east versus west, communist versus capitalist tone. Again, it is a question. And again, we get this answer starting with sir, which again supports the idea that speaker 2 might be military or might be a Vietnamese citizen. And again, the caesura creates that hesitant tone. No one really remembers what Vietnam was like. Sir, laughter is bitter to the burned mouth. I've underlined laughter in the question and laughter in the answer, so you can see that they match. And I want to draw your attention to the b in bitter and burned. The alliteration sounds quite explosive, maybe a bit like a bomb, and it sounds like there's something you don't like in your mouth, such as a bitter taste, and you're trying to spit it out. And I believe this is a reference to napalm. So if you remember that chemical, like petrol or diesel, that has been mixed with a jelly substance, so it sticks on you and burns. Imagine a napalm strike has come over your village, and there's napalm on your lips, and your lips are burning for a few minutes, and the flesh is fusing together, and the skin is charring. Will you be able to laugh? No, because it's going to hurt, and you'll be suffering. So in the past, Vietnamese people laughed, of course they did, but nowadays they don't laugh anymore because it hurts. Whether it physically hurts because their mouth has been burnt by napalm, or whether it sort of figuratively hurts that they're watching the loss of their country, their culture, their language, their religion, and they feel the pain of that. Moving on to the 4th question and answer. Did they use bone and ivory, jade and silver for ornament? Again, broken record. Did is past tense. They is creating a them versus us attitude. Again, Vietnam is presented beautifully with natural imagery. Bone, ivory, jade, silver. These are all natural resources that if you ever visit Vietnam, and I've been lucky enough to visit Vietnam, they create these wonderful ornaments, these wonderful like statues and jewellery made from their natural abundance of resources. Again, we have a question here. The answer to the question is this: a dream ago, perhaps. I want to focus on this word dream. I think it could have 2 meanings. It could be that speaker 2 is dreaming of old Vietnam before it was bombed and destroyed. Again, this might suggest that the speaker 2 is Vietnamese, and they're dreaming of the past before Vietnam was destroyed, and they're dreaming of all the bone and ivory, jade and silver ornaments that were made. Alternatively, you can argue that the only way to view Vietnam now is in a dream, because it no longer exists in reality. You have to use a dream, you have to use your imagination to try and uncover what that culture was like, because it has now been destroyed. So I think dream can have 2 interpretations here. Again, the caesura, the comma, creates pausing and hesitancy. No one's really certain what's happened to Vietnam because it has what Vietnam was like, because it has been destroyed by America. And that is reinforced with the adverb perhaps, creates this uncertain tone. Now, the line "ornament is for joy" reveals that in time of peace, citizens are able to invest their time in making jewellery and making statues. But obviously, when war is on, everyone's fighting the war. There's no time to do hobbies and crafts such as making jewellery and ornaments. All the bones were charred. I've underlined bones because we get bone in the question and bone in the answer. But I also think that this is a reference to those search and destroy missions I told you about, where American troops would be hunting down communist sympathizers and would ultimately burn entire villages and kill villagers, a bit like they did with My Lai and the My Lai massacre. So in Vietnam, they used bones from animals to create tools, but now they can't use bones anymore because all the bones are charred. They've been burnt, they're black, they're crumbly. You can't use them for tools anymore. And that's because of America's influence in Vietnam. It is not remembered, full stop, which is a caesura, remember. I think this repetition of remember is important, and particularly the second time. When Levertov uses remember here, it's an imperative. That means it's a command, an instruction. She is asking people to remember Vietnam, remember that they were humans, they had a culture, and that we destroyed it. And in the same way, I think Speaker 2 is asking Speaker 1, the news reporter, to remember that these people were humans just like us. They had wives and husbands and families and dreams just like American people do. Remember, most were peasants. Again, the use of peasants. A peasant is someone who is relatively poor. They have to work every day in order to survive. And a lot of Vietnamese people are farmers. They grow a lot of rice, a lot of bamboo, and this wouldn't have made them very rich. So they wouldn't have had weaponry to defend themselves. They wouldn't have invested in the military as much as a capitalistic society like America has, where maybe most Americans wouldn't be considered peasants. They'd be working more middle-class, higher-paid jobs. And as a result, there's more money in their economy that they can use to develop weapons. So the word peasants makes the war sound really unfair. You've got Vietnamese people having to use Viet Cong tactics, like guerrilla tactics, like living underground and making weapons out of bamboo and rubber. And then you've got America with their modern capitalism and wealth, using aeroplanes and bombs and chemicals. This was not a fair conflict at all. And I think the word peasants gets that across. And Levertov's reminding us that most Vietnamese people, their life was in rice and bamboo. Again, this idea of natural imagery. These were peaceful people. They grew rice, they ate the rice, they had families, they sang songs, they made tools from natural resources. They were just getting on with their own lives, minding their own business. Why did China and America have to get involved with Vietnam and cause so much suffering? We're on to question 5 and answer 5, which is about Vietnamese art. Had they an epic poem is the question Speaker 1 asks. Had is the past tense. They create a them versus us attitude. The question mark denotes a question, an interrogative line. An epic poem is a symbol of Western culture. It's a form of poetry that's really popular in the West. You may have heard of Homer, who wrote the Iliad. Maybe you've heard of Milton, who wrote Paradise Lost. Maybe you've heard of Virgil, who wrote Aeneid. These are all Westerners who have created an epic poem. An epic poem is a poem that is really, really long, and it tells the story of a character. And it usually, as the name suggests, there's epic moments where the character does battles, and it's a story written in a poem form. And it's unique to the West. This is something we like and we value as a symbol of high art in Western culture. Now, Vietnam is in the East, so they do not have epic poems. They have their own style of poetry. I am not very good at pronouncing in Vietnamese, but they have a type of poem called Luk Bat and Shon That Luk Bat. Again, forgive my pronunciation. Vietnamese is a tonal language, and I'm very bad at tonal languages. But it's very arrogant for speaker one to think that just because in the West we have epic poems as our famous highbrow art, that in the East Vietnamese should be writing the same poems as we do, because obviously we are the West, and we are capitalist and we are right. So surely the East should be trying to copy us. It's very ignorant, it's a very arrogant attitude, because actually in Vietnam they have their own poetry and their own forms of art, which are separate to the West and should be just as valued and just as respected. Okay, the answer to this. When peaceful clouds were reflected in the paddies and the water buffalo stepped surely along terraces. Clouds, natural imagery. A paddy is a rice field where rice grows. If you've never seen a rice paddy, you can Google image it, but it's basically a very wet field that rice grows through. Water buffalo, again, if you haven't seen them, you can Google them. They're massive creatures with huge horns, and you'd think they'd be really big and muscular and violent, but actually they're very peaceful, very tame animals. And terraces are where the paddies were. So if you Google Vietnamese rice terrace, you'll see these images of layers upon layers of paddy fields sort of stacked up and down mountains and hills. And it creates this very beautiful natural image. And Levertov is describing Vietnam as naturally very beautiful. The clouds are peaceful, the animals they have, the water buffalo, are peaceful, the paddies provide food, the terraces, if you look at those images, create a beautiful scenery. Vietnam is a gorgeous green country until America comes along and does some damage. Maybe fathers told their sons old tales. I've underlined tales because an epic poem is a tale, a story. And a tale here is, again, a story that a father might tell the son. So this clearly matches question 5 and answer 5. Maybe fathers told their son old tales. However, they don't do that anymore because bombs smashed those mirrors and there was only time to scream. You can contrast the peaceful natural imagery of Vietnam, clouds, paddies, buffalo terraces, with the violent imagery of America's influence, bombs, smashing, screaming. There's a real contrast here of images. The mirror here is a metaphor. So I told you that paddies are basically wet, water-soaked, waterlogged fields where rice grows. When you have a big body of water, it reflects like a mirror. So here, the mirrors are the rice paddies full of water and rice, and the bomb is smashing the mirror, breaking that illusion of reflection and causing damage. And the idea of a broken mirror in Western culture means normally bad luck. Broken mirrors are sharp and deadly, and again, this reflects this uncomfortable deadliness that America has caused to the Vietnamese people and Vietnam as a country. Okay, hang in there, long video. We're on the 6th and final question and the 6th and final answer. Did they distinguish between speech and singing? Again, did, past tense, they, the pronoun creates a them versus us attitude. The question mark denotes that it is a question. And this is a really ignorant question to ask. So this is a question about Vietnamese culture. Now, when I visited Vietnam, I had many questions. Maybe, what language did they speak? What food did they eat? Is it polite to shake hands, or should I bow instead? These are more useful questions to learn about Vietnam's culture. To ask, did the Vietnamese people, could you tell the difference between them speaking and singing? I think is quite ignorant. I mean, of course you can. In pretty much every language, there is a difference between speaking and singing. So again, it's presenting that American interviewer, that journalist, in quite a negative tone. And remember, this protest poem is designed to criticize America. The answer to the question, there is an echo yet. I like this. Is present tense. So by changing the tense at the end, I think Levertov is suggesting there's hope. If we stop the war, there might be a tiny bit of Vietnam left, and that bit of Vietnam can grow, and the language will be preserved, and the art and the culture and the craftsmanship will be preserved. Alternatively, you could interpret it to say that as long as people remember Vietnam and the culture, it sort of lives on in people's memories, which is why some analysts would say that the second speaker in this poem is a historian, and they're trying to preserve this lost Vietnamese culture in this hypothetical world Levertov created, where America completely destroyed Vietnam. There is an echo yet of their speech, which was like a song. Again, I've underlined speech and singing in the answer because they match in the question. This is a simile comparing speech to a song using like. So it was saying that Vietnamese language is quite beautiful to listen to. And if you remember earlier, I told you it's tonal. So again, the words, the sounds go up and down. So it does sound quite musical. I haven't included the simile as a technique because it's a bit of a basic simile. And I think the metaphor that comes later is more important. It was reported their singing resembled the flight of moths in moonlight. Now, this is a cool metaphor. This compares Vietnamese people singing to that soft, gentle, delicate sound of a moth's wings flying. That soft flapping, that whooshing of air is similar to Vietnamese people singing. How beautiful is their singing for it to be compared to the flight of a moth? I think that's a gorgeous metaphor. And our attention is drawn to it by the alliteration of the M sound in moth and moonlight. So again, through the use of comparing Vietnamese people to nature, such as moths, Levertov is painting this image that they're a peaceful country, they're a peaceful, natural people, and what America did with their unnatural, man-made bombs and planes and chemicals was completely destroy this culture. The final line is really interesting. Who can say? If you remember the question and answer structure, stanza 1 is 6 questions and stanza 2 is 6 answers. However, in the very last line, Levertov adds a 7th question, who can say? Now, this is a rhetorical question because it doesn't get answered. And what it does is it creates more questions than answers. And I think this is suggesting that war creates more questions than answers. Conflict creates more problems than it does solutions. And again, we've lost Vietnam, we've lost their culture, their religion, their craftsmanship. The world is a poorer place because of it. Who can say what Vietnam was like? We don't know because it's gone, thanks to conflict, thanks to America getting involved. And that final bit, it is silent now. A bit like the word dream, I think there's 2 meanings here. The silent could mean the war is over and, Vietnam is silent now. The bombs from Operation Rolling Thunder no longer drop. There's no longer this noise of explosion over Vietnam. The second meaning could be that Vietnam is silent. The whole country has been destroyed. The people have been destroyed. The culture, the religion, the identity is all gone. And this once wonderful, diverse, rich, fascinating country and culture has forever been silenced by warfare, by conflict, by America's influence over it. So a couple of meanings there. Wow, you've hung in there for a long time. Thank you for that. My advice to you would be to make some notes on this video, on a physical copy of the poem, and then you may go on to answer the question, how does Levertov explore the effects of war and what were they like? Maybe introduce the Vietnam War, introduce where conflict is seen in the poem. Maybe explore some of those language features Levertov uses. I would particularly focus on the metaphors used, or maybe the repetition of the did they, creating that past tense and that them versus us attitude. Structurally, definitely explore the question and answer format and the free verse and the irregularity of it to try and create that interview, that dialogue sound. Poetically speaking, you've got to talk about the tone and the imagery. They're very rich. Natural imagery equals Vietnam equals peaceful. Violent imagery equals America equals man-made equals war. And finally, draw some conclusions of your own. How does Levertov explore the effects of war and what were they like? If I was you, you've got to have some keywords in there, such as suffering and loss of culture. Okay, if you liked this very long video, please give it a like if you found it useful to your understanding of this beautiful poem. Number 2, please subscribe to the Mr. Hardy YouTube channel so you get all the video analysis of the OCR conflict poems. And finally, leave a comment if you think there is a key quote or a key piece of information about the Vietnam War, or anything you want to share that I may have forgotten. Thank you for your attention, and I'll see you on the next one.